No! Step away from the door! Keep your hands up where I can see them!
My residence. Identify yourself and state your authority.
You can explain that downtown. Turn around, right now!
I am a... You are making a serious...
I don't care what you say you are! You're being...
At 6:47 a.m. on a quiet Saturday morning in Pasadena, California, a black woman in a bathrobe stepped out of her front door to retrieve the newspaper from the end of her driveway. Birds were singing, coffee was brewing inside, 2 grandchildren were still asleep in the guest room down the hall. The street was lined with mature oaks and well-kept homes, the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened. The woman was Justice Vivian Ashford, 58 years old, Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. She had spent more than 30 years in law. She had served as a federal prosecutor, then as an appellate judge, before being appointed to the state's highest court 6 years earlier. Legal scholars called her one of the sharpest minds on the bench. She had written landmark opinions on civil liberties, police accountability, and constitutional protections that were cited in law schools across the country. That morning, none of that mattered to the men inside the black SUV rolling slowly down Mariposa Lane. All they saw was a black woman standing alone in a driveway, and that was enough. The man behind the wheel of that SUV was ICE Supervisory Agent Dalton Voss, 44 years old, 16 years with the agency. Voss was known internally for what supervisors politely called high-yield operations. In practice, that meant aggressive tactics, maximum arrests, and minimal paperwork. He ran his team like every sweep was a raid, every target a threat, every door an obstacle. 9 formal complaints had been filed against him by civil rights attorneys over the years. Every single one had been buried or dismissed. Sitting beside him was Agent Nolan Strack, 31, 4 years on the job, the kind of junior agent who never questioned a senior officer's call. Strack followed Voss the way a shadow follows a body. He laughed when Voss laughed. He moved when Voss moved. And when Voss made a decision, Strack backed it without hesitation. That morning, the two of them were running a targeted immigration sweep in the Pasadena area based on a tip about undocumented individuals somewhere in the neighborhood. Their warrant named a specific address, 412 Mariposa Lane. Justice Vivian Ashford lived at 414 Mariposa Lane, 1 house over, 2 digits apart, but Voss never double-checked. He didn't verify the house number, he didn't confirm the name on the mailbox, he didn't cross-reference the address on the warrant with the property in front of him. He saw a black woman in a driveway, and his assumptions did the rest. He put the SUV in park, opened his door, and stepped onto the curb with the confidence of a man who had never once been held accountable for being wrong. Voss stepped out of the SUV first. Strack followed half a second later. 2 additional agents climbed out from the back seats, both in tactical vests with ICE printed across the chest. 4 federal agents, armed and deliberate, walking up the driveway of a 5-8-year-old woman in a bathrobe holding a Saturday newspaper. Voss led the approach. His hand rested on his belt. His posture was wide, aggressive, the stance of a man who had already decided how this was going to go before a single word was spoken. He stopped 5 feet from Ashford and didn't introduce himself, didn't show credentials, didn't explain why 4 armed men were standing on her property before 7 in the morning. He started with a command. I need to see identification. Who are you? Who else is inside this residence? Are you a United States citizen? Ashford looked at the 4 men, then back at Voss. Her voice was steady. My name is Vivian Ashford. I am an Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. This is my home. Voss tilted his head slightly and let out a short laugh. Sure you are. He glanced at Strack. People say all kinds of things. Strack moved without being told, stepping to the side and positioning himself between Ashford and her front door. She noticed it immediately. She had spent 3 decades in courtrooms reading body language, watching how power was used and misused. She knew what a blocked exit meant. Do you have a warrant for this address? She asked. Voss ignored the question entirely. Put your hands where I can see them. She was standing in her own driveway, in her bathrobe, holding a newspaper. And a federal agent was telling her to show her hands as if she were a suspect in a crime that didn't exist. Ashford spoke again, slower this time. each word delivered with the precision of someone who had spent a career choosing language carefully. I am Justice Vivian Ashford of the California Supreme Court. I am asking you again, do you have a warrant for this address? Voss stepped closer. That mouth is going to get you in trouble. His right hand shot out and grabbed her arm just above the elbow. He spun her around hard enough that her slippers scraped across the concrete. The newspaper slipped from her fingers and landed flat on the driveway. Her reading glasses, knocked loose from the force of the turn, hit the pavement and cracked. Strack moved in immediately, taking her other arm and pulling it behind her back. Ashford's voice stayed controlled even as her body was being forced into position. You are making a grave mistake. I am not resisting. Voss didn't respond. He pulled a set of handcuffs from his belt and locked them around her wrists. The metallic click echoed in the early morning silence. A sitting justice of the California Supreme Court was now in handcuffs in her own driveway, detained by federal agents who had no warrant for her address, no probable cause, and no legal basis to touch her. Across the street, Edwin Choi, 72, a retired aerospace engineer, had been watering his garden when the SUV pulled up. He watched the entire approach. When the handcuffs came out, he set down his hose, pulled his phone from his shirt pocket, and began recording. 2 doors down, Sandra Oyelaran, 45, a professor of applied physics at Caltech, stepped outside when she heard the raised voices. She saw Ashford in cuffs and shouted across the lawn. What are you doing? Stop. Leave her alone. Strack turned toward her. Ma'am, go back inside your home, or you will be detained. Oyelaran didn't move. Her phone was already in her hand. Inside the house, the shouting reached the guest room at the end of the hall. Elijah, 10, woke first. He sat up in bed and listened. The voices were sharp, male, commanding. They didn't belong to anyone he knew. He slid out of bed and walked to the front window of the living room. What he saw through the glass would stay with him for the rest of his life. His grandmother was standing in the driveway in her bathrobe, her arms behind her back, metal cuffs around her wrists. 4 men in tactical vests with guns on their hips surrounded her. One of them had his hand on her shoulder. Elijah screamed. The sound woke Simone, 7, who came running down the hallway calling for her grandmother. When she reached the living room and saw her brother pressed against the window, shaking, she began to cry. Neither child understood what was happening. Neither child had been told. Before either of them could reach the front door, it opened from the outside. A third agent, one of the 2 who had exited the back of the SUV, stepped into the home without knocking, without permission, and without a warrant. He saw the 2 children standing in the living room, one screaming, one sobbing. He reached for his radio. There are kids in here. Voss's voice came back through the speaker, flat and unbothered. Secure them. The agent looked at Elijah and Simone. Sit down on the couch. Don't move. Simone's voice broke through her tears. Where's my grandma? What are you doing to my grandma? The agent said nothing. He stood near the door with his arms crossed and offered no comfort, no explanation, no reassurance. 2 children, 10 and 7, held in place on their grandmother's couch by an armed federal agent who had entered the home without legal authority. That detail, when it became public, would become the single most explosive element of the entire case, and it was already being recorded. Across the street, Edwin Choi held his phone steady with both hands. The camera captured everything. Ashford in cuffs, her calm, measured protests, Voss standing over her with his chest out and his jaw set, Strack positioned between her and the front door like a wall, the cracked reading glasses on the pavement, the newspaper lying where it had fallen. Every frame was sharp, every word was audible. 2 doors down, Sandra Oyelaran recorded from her front yard at a different angle. Her hands were shaking visibly, not from fear but from anger. Her footage caught what Choi's couldn't. The moment the third agent pushed open the front door and disappeared inside the house without anyone inviting him in. Choi lowered his phone just long enough to dial 911. When the dispatcher answered, he spoke quickly. Federal agents are outside my neighbor's house. They've handcuffed her in her driveway. She's a justice of the California Supreme Court. There was a pause on the line. "Sir, can you repeat that?" He said it again, slower. "They have her in handcuffs. She's a sitting justice. They're in her house now. There are children inside." The dispatcher flagged the call as priority. Oyelaran didn't wait for 911. She called the Pasadena Police Department directly. Her voice was tight, controlled, furious. She gave the address, described what she was seeing, and demanded officers respond immediately. A jogger who had been running up Mariposa Lane slowed, then stopped completely when he saw the scene. He pulled out his phone and began filming from the sidewalk. No one told him to leave. No one noticed him at all. Within 20 minutes of Voss stepping out of that SUV, 3 independent recordings existed from 3 different angles. None of them showed a crime being committed by Vivian Ashford. All of them showed crimes being committed against her. The Pasadena PD cruiser came around the corner of Mariposa Lane 7 minutes after the 911 call. 2 officers stepped out. The first was Sergeant Diana Reeves, 46, a 19-year veteran of the department with a reputation for being calm under pressure and intolerant of nonsense. Her partner stayed near the vehicle. Reeves took in the scene in 3 seconds. A black woman in a bathrobe, handcuffed in a driveway, 4 men in tactical vests with ice markings, neighbors on porches with phones raised, cracked glasses on the ground, a newspaper lying in the middle of the concrete. She walked straight to Voss. "What's going on here?" Voss didn't look at her when he answered. "Immigration enforcement operation. Federal matter. Local PD can stand down." Reeves didn't move. "I'm not standing down. I responded to a 911 call reporting a unlawful detention. Show me the warrant." Voss exhaled through his nose, annoyed, but reached into his vest and produced the folded document. He handed it over like it proved something. Reeves opened it. Her eyes moved to the address line. 2412 Mariposa Lane. She looked up. Then she looked at the house. At the numbers beside the front door, 414. She folded the warrant and handed it back. "You're at the wrong house." Voss blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Strack, standing 2 steps behind him, went pale. Reeves continued, "And this woman is Justice Vivian Ashford of the California Supreme Court. Remove the handcuffs." "Now." Voss didn't move. "We're still verifying the situation." "There's nothing to verify," Reeves said. "You're at the wrong address. Your warrant doesn't apply here. Take the cuffs off." Voss shifted his weight. His jaw tightened. He looked at Strack, then back at Reeves. "I need to confirm with my Sergeant." Reeves raised her voice. She didn't shout, but every person on that street heard her clearly. "I said remove the handcuffs. Now." Across the street, Edwin Choi's phone captured every second. The hesitation, the defiance. The moment a local sergeant had to tell a federal agent twice to stop breaking the law. The standoff lasted several more minutes. Voss stood with his feet planted, jaw locked, the posture of a man trying to find a way to maintain authority he had already lost. Reeves didn't repeat herself a third time. She simply stood between Voss and Ashford with her body cam running and waited. It was Strack who finally moved. He stepped forward, reached for the cuffs, and looked at Voss. Voss gave a barely perceptible nod, the kind of gesture a man makes when he wants to pretend the decision was still his. The cuffs came off. Ashford brought her wrists forward slowly. The skin was red, pressed with the pattern of the metal. Her robe had twisted and pulled loose during the struggle. Her reading glasses lay cracked on the pavement beside the newspaper she had come outside to collect what now felt like a lifetime ago. She was trembling, not from fear. Vivian Ashford had faced down hostile courtrooms, argued before federal panels, and written opinions that changed the legal landscape of an entire state. She was trembling from fury, the kind that doesn't explode but calculates. She turned to Voss and looked directly into his face. "You entered my property without a warrant. You put your hands on me without cause. You sent an agent into my home where my grandchildren were sleeping. I want your full names. I want your badge numbers. I want your supervisor's name and contact information. Every single word of what just happened is going to matter." Voss's tone shifted, smaller now. "Ma'am, it was a mistake. We had the wrong address. Ashford didn't blink. A mistake is knocking on the wrong door. What you did was assault. Reeves stepped to the side, keyed her radio, and spoke clearly. Captain, this is Reeves on Mariposa Lane. We have a major incident. Federal agents detained a sitting California Supreme Court justice at her home without a warrant. Children were involved. I need command staff here immediately. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice came back. Repeat that. Reeves repeated it, word for word. The silence that followed said everything. Within the hour, the phone calls began. They started local and climbed fast. Sergeant Reeves's captain arrived on scene, took one look at the situation, and called the Pasadena city attorney from his car. The city attorney listened for less than a minute before calling the California Attorney General's office. That call was answered immediately. Inside the house, Vivian Ashford sat at her kitchen table. Her grandchildren were in the next room with a neighbor who had come over to sit with them. Simone had stopped crying but wouldn't let go of her brother's hand. Elijah hadn't spoken a word since the agents left the front porch. Ashford was still in her bathrobe. Her wrists still carried the red impressions of the cuffs. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was not. She picked up the phone and called the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. She gave a precise, factual account. No emotion, no editorializing, just the facts. Federal agents arrived at my home at approximately 6:50 a.m. They had a warrant for a different address. They handcuffed me in my driveway. They entered my home without permission. My grandchildren were inside. They were held by an armed agent without explanation. The Chief Justice listened without interrupting. When Ashford finished, the Chief Justice made one call to the governor's office. The governor's office made one call to the United States Department of Justice. By mid-morning, the incident on Mariposa Lane had reached Washington. Separately, Sandra O'Yelaran sat on her front steps with her phone in her hand. She trimmed her video down to 90 seconds, the most damning 90 seconds, and posted it to social media with a caption that read, "ICE agents just handcuffed a California Supreme Court justice in her driveway in her bathrobe, in front of her grandchildren. They had the wrong house." Within 2 hours, the video had been viewed over 1 million times, and it was still climbing. By that afternoon, the DHS Office of Inspector General had opened a formal investigation. ICE headquarters in Washington was blindsided. No one at the agency's national level had authorized or been made aware of a high-profile enforcement operation at a judicial officer's residence. Voss's operational paperwork was pulled within hours. The warrant was reviewed line by line. The target address was 412 Mariposa Lane. Ashford's home was 414. The file contained no pre-operation verification of the target address, no confirmation that the location matched the warrant, no cross-referencing of neighboring properties, no awareness whatsoever that a sitting justice of the California Supreme Court lived one house over from the intended target. Internal reviewers also discovered that Voss's team had conducted no surveillance before the operation, no drive-by, no advanced scout, no visual confirmation. Pre-operation surveillance was standard protocol for residential enforcement actions, a basic safeguard designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic error. Voss had skipped it entirely. His file showed a pattern of shortcuts, operations launched on incomplete intelligence, addresses verified after the fact rather than before, paperwork filed retroactively. A senior DHS official convened a closed-door briefing later that day. According to two people present, the official stood at the head of the table, looked around the room, and said, "This is the worst operational failure I have seen in 20 years." They handcuffed a sitting justice, on camera, with children in the house. No one in the room responded. There was nothing to say. The footage was already everywhere. The phone calls had already reached the highest levels of government. And the machinery of accountability, slow as it often was, had already begun to move in a direction that Dalton Voss and Nolan Strack could not outrun. The investigators moved fast. Within 48 hours of the incident, every piece of available evidence had been collected, cataloged, and placed under federal review. Body camera footage was the first priority. Voss's camera had not been activated. He claimed later it was an oversight, that the device had malfunctioned, that he hadn't realized it wasn't recording. Investigators noted that this was the fourth time in 3 years Voss had failed to activate his body camera during a field operation that resulted in a complaint. The pattern was not lost on anyone reviewing the file, but Strack's camera had been running. From the moment he stepped out of the SUV to the moment Sergeant Reeves ordered the cuffs removed, his body cam captured everything. The footage confirmed every detail. Ashford's calm, measured identification of herself, Voss's dismissive laugh, the words, "Sure you are," spoken with a tone that no amount of context could soften. Strack blocking the path to the front door, Voss grabbing her arm, the newspaper falling, the glasses cracking on the pavement, the handcuffs locking into place, and inside the house, picked up through the open front door, the sound of children screaming. Investigators also pulled Edwin Choi's cell phone video, Sandra Oyelaran's recording from her front yard, the jogger's footage from the sidewalk, Sergeant Reeves's body cam, the 911 audio, dispatch logs, and every operational planning document associated with that morning's sweep. Each source told the same story from a different angle. None of them contradicted each other. All of them pointed in the same direction. Internal Affairs then pulled Voss's personnel file. 9 formal complaints from civil rights attorneys spanning more than a decade. 2 of those complaints specifically alleged racial profiling during immigration enforcement sweeps. Both had been dismissed without a full investigation. 3 others cited excessive force during residential operations. All closed with findings of insufficient evidence. The pattern didn't emerge slowly. It was already there, fully formed, waiting for someone to finally look at it. The story broke nationally on a Monday morning. By Tuesday, it was everywhere. Every major network ran the footage. Cable news played it on a loop. The cell phone videos from Choi and Oyelaran were embedded in every online article, shared millions of times, commented on in dozens of languages. Legal commentators used words that rarely appeared in cable news segments. Unprecedented violation of judicial independence, constitutional crisis at the doorstep, assault on the separation of powers. One former federal judge, speaking on a morning broadcast, said plainly that in 40 years of practice, he had never seen a sitting member of a state's highest court handcuffed by federal agents on her own property without a warrant. The California State Bar issued a formal statement condemning the incident and calling for a full federal investigation. The NAACP demanded immediate accountability and structural reform within ICE. Civil liberties organizations filed amicus briefs in support of any future legal action before a case had even been announced. A press conference was held midweek. Civil rights attorneys stood behind a podium with Ashford's permission and displayed 2 photographs. The first showed her wrists, bruised and marked where the handcuffs had pressed into her skin. The second showed her reading glasses, cracked and lying on the driveway concrete. The images were published on the front page of 4 national newspapers, but it was a quote from a 10-year-old boy that cut through everything else. In a newspaper interview conducted with his mother's consent, Elijah sat in his grandmother's living room and said 7 words that became the defining line of the national conversation. "I saw my grandma in handcuffs. I thought they were going to take her away." That quote was reprinted in editorials, cited in congressional floor speeches, and shared so widely online that it became impossible to discuss the case without hearing it. Protests formed outside the ICE field office in Los Angeles. They were calm, organized, and persistent. Elected officials at every level, city council members, state legislators, members of Congress, issued public statements demanding answers. And in Pasadena, on a quiet street where the house numbers 412 and 414 sat side by side, the answers were already taking shape in the form of evidence that no statement, no press briefing, and no internal review could make disappear. The terminations came down 5 weeks after the incident. There was no quiet reassignment, no administrative leave stretched into silence, no resignation accepted in lieu of discipline. The findings were made public, and the language was unsparing. Supervisory Agent Dalton Voss was terminated for gross misconduct, operational negligence, excessive use of force, failure to verify a warrant address prior to execution, unauthorized entry into a private residence, failure to activate a body camera during a field operation, and conduct unbecoming a federal agent. His federal law enforcement credentials were revoked. He was barred from future employment with any federal agency. 16 years with ICE, 9 buried complaints, and a career built on shortcuts and aggression ended in a single memorandum of termination that would follow his name for the rest of his life. Agent Nolan Strack was fired for failure to intervene during an unlawful detention, active participation in the warrantless restraint of a civilian, and enabling the unauthorized entry into a private home where minor children were present. His credentials were suspended pending further review, a formality that effectively guaranteed he would never work in federal law enforcement again. 4 years of following without questioning. 4 years of backing every call, laughing at every joke, never once saying, "Stop." That silence now carried a price. The 2 additional agents who had been on scene received formal reprimands and multi-week suspensions without pay. One of them, the agent who had entered the home and stood over 2 terrified children without offering a word of explanation, was reassigned to a desk position indefinitely. Voss's former supervisor, the man who had reviewed and dismissed 9 complaints over more than a decade, was placed under internal review. The review found a pattern of deliberate inaction, complaints from civil rights attorneys filed and never followed up, red flags documented and never escalated. He was given 2 options: early retirement or formal proceedings. He chose retirement. ICE's regional field office director, who had overseen the unit responsible for that morning's sweep, was reassigned to a non-operational role in Washington. A federal consent decree was imposed on the regional office requiring sweeping reforms: mandatory pre-operation address verification with independent sign-off, body camera activation required for all field operations with automatic disciplinary triggers for non-compliance, a civilian oversight panel with authority to review operational planning and complaint disposition. The decree would remain in effect for 5 years, monitored by a federal judge. The machinery that had protected Dalton Voss for 16 years had finally been forced to dismantle the system it had built around him. 8 weeks after the terminations, Justice Vivian Ashford filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Central District of California. The defendants were Dalton Voss, Nolan Strack, the 2 additional agents, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Department of Homeland Security. The complaint was 47 pages long. It alleged unlawful detention in violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments, excessive force against a compliant, unarmed civilian, warrantless entry into a private residence, unlawful seizure of a person without probable cause, racial profiling as a motivating factor in the agent's decision-making, intentional infliction of emotional distress upon both the justice and her 2 minor grandchildren, and a claim that appeared in no standard civil rights template, violation of judicial independence through the physical detention and restraint of a sitting member of a state's highest court by agents of the federal executive branch. The evidence attached to the complaint was overwhelming: Strack's body camera footage, 3 independent cell phone recordings, Sergeant Reeves's body cam, the 911 audio, dispatch logs, the warrant showing the wrong address, Voss's operational file showing no pre-operation verification, his personnel record showing 9 dismissed complaints, photographs of Ashford's bruised wrists, photographs of her cracked glasses on the pavement, a written statement from the agent who entered the home confirming that he encountered 2 minor children inside and was instructed by Voss to secure them, medical records documenting the children's subsequent treatment for anxiety and sleep disturbances. The government's attorneys reviewed the evidence and requested a settlement conference before the case reached discovery. The settlement was reached 4 months later. The dollar amount was historic, placing it among the largest civil rights settlements ever paid in a case involving federal immigration enforcement. But Ashford had made clear from the beginning that money alone was not the point. The settlement included structural demands that went far beyond the regional consent decree: a national review of ICE operational protocols for residential enforcement actions, mandatory address verification procedures requiring independent confirmation before any warrant execution at a private residence, a civilian complaint review process with binding authority over disposition of misconduct allegations, annual civil rights audits of enforcement teams conducted by an independent body with public reporting requirements. Legal scholars called it one of the most consequential civil rights settlements in the history of federal immigration enforcement. Law journals published analyses of the case before the ink on the agreement was dry, and Ashford, in a brief public statement released the day the settlement was finalized, announced that a portion of the funds would be donated to establish a legal defense fund for immigrant families who had been subjected to unlawful raids and had no resources to fight back. She said simply, "I had a name and a title that forced people to pay attention. Most people who experience what I experienced do not. This fund is for them." Justice Vivian Ashford returned to the bench 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized. There was no press conference. She simply walked into the courthouse on a Monday morning, put on her robe, and took her seat. She rarely spoke about the incident publicly. She declined most interview requests and turned down invitations to speak at rallies and panels. But once, in a rare sit-down with a legal journal, she said something that would be quoted more than any opinion she had ever written. "I am a justice of the highest court in this state. If they did this to me in my driveway, in my bathrobe, imagine what they do to people who have no title, no camera, no neighbor willing to record. That is why this matters." Dalton Voss left California within months of his termination. His name was permanently tied to the case. Every search returned the same footage, the same headlines. No agency would consider him. No security firm would take the risk. The career built on aggression and shortcuts was gone, replaced by a record that would define him for the rest of his life. Nolan Strack learned that silence carried its own sentence. He had not given the orders, but he had blocked her path, helped force her arms behind her back, and when the moment came to intervene, he did nothing. His career ended with the quiet, documented absence of conscience. Months later, Elijah's fifth-grade teacher assigned a personal essay. He wrote 4 pages in pencil titled "The Morning They Took My Grandma." It was published unedited by a national magazine and became one of the most widely shared pieces of the year. In Pasadena, on a quiet street where the numbers 412 and 414 sit side by side, a Supreme Court justice still retrieves her newspaper every morning. No one has come to her driveway since. This case was brutal, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.